Hello, welcome to Ending Well with Minnelle. I'm Minnelle. I'm the pre-planning funeral director at the New Haven Funeral Center. I'm also an end-of-life doula and a certified executor assistant. That all comes together in me becoming your end-of-life educator. I love putting on this platform because it helps to normalize the conversation, and the more we know, the more apt we are to actually act and start going forward with our legacy plans. So I'm very excited to have Yanique Russell with me today. She is an accredited, wonderful, and highly recommended lawyer. If you'd like to say a quick hello and introduce yourself, please.
Absolutely. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, Minnelle. I'm Yanique Russell. I'm an attorney and I practice wills and estates, immigration, and business law. I do enjoy ensuring that I am educating not just our community, but just about everyone I come across about the importance of estate planning.
Yes,
Thank
I
you.
like that. It's a weird thing to be passionate about, but it's very important. And once you've been in the industry for a while, you really start feeling that and you want to pass it on with others
Exactly.
around us, right?
Exactly.
Okay. So let's get started. First thing first is the intro question, the icebreaker question. So, if today was your last day on earth, what is one message you would want to leave for the world? Just tell people.
I'd love to let everyone know hate is such a waste of emotion. It rarely hurts no one else but the carrier, and it will serve you no good.
Yeah.
So it's better to release everything and love everyone. Yeah. That's the message I'd like to leave.
I'll take that, a beautiful reminder, right? Focus
Yeah.
on love and don't carry that weight.
Yeah.
The hate. What is it my mom used to say? We used to hear it in church. It's like carrying those heaping coals on your own
on
head.
your head. Exactly. Yeah.
So there we go. Good reminder, good reminder. Okay, so let's get into the conversation. And this is a free-flowing conversation, so we'll start here and we'll see where we end up. What are some common misconceptions that people have when it comes to preparing their estates? And especially, let's talk about people who have estates overseas as well.
Absolutely. I'll start by saying everyone will tell you, oh, it's not yet time for me to do estate planning. I'm still young.
Yeah.
I still
Yeah.
have some time.
Yes.
Let's do this a little later, maybe when I'm retired. And that's a misconception because for some reason we gloss over the fact, and I believe the pandemic brought it back home for so many of us, that, we're not indispensable. Like, we will not be living forever. And it makes absolutely no sense to carry on without putting the proper plans in place. So, that's one of the first misconceptions and the biggest one, that you have time. The second is that for some reason, people believe that the minute you draft a will, the Grim Reaper is going to come on the scene.
Yes.
I'm going to kick the bucket because now I've entertained the conversation of death and, what I'm planning to ensure happens when I pass. Absolutely the furthest thing from the truth. It actually does way more harm to not have a plan in place. So that's the second misconception. And the third, especially when it comes on to having assets in another jurisdiction, people tend to believe that the will they create, let's say in Ontario, is going to cover the assets, the estate back home. It may not. Oftentimes it does not, right? So it's very important that you are speaking with an attorney if you have especially real property in another jurisdiction, because there are so many things that need to be contemplated.
Yeah. So we were talking about that before, because that's one of the issues that I ran into, thinking everything is fine, the estate is okay, and then having a will in Canada and then having something back home. Like, there was nothing back home.
Wow.
So now it's trying to mitigate both. And there's a lot of people that are watching, a lot of people that are experiencing this, that are the children of parents who think that back then, like, you didn't really have to do very much with You did, but they didn't. Very much with regards to wills, it was simple.
Right.
Now we have estates, corporations, businesses, and things all over. So how do we start? Let's talk about either ourselves or the next generation above us. How do we even begin this process of estate planning with everything that we have?
Absolutely. So one of the things you need to, move away from is to get away from having that mindset that I do not own anything. I don't have a house. I don't need to make a will. I don't need to have an estate plan because I don't own anything, right? The minute you start a family, you need to have some sort of estate planning done because, especially in Ontario, it will be the courts who get to decide who becomes a guardian for children where the parents pass and leave young children behind, right? Coming back to, immovables, meaning real property, right? If it is that you have estate back home, which includes real property, one of the first things you need to start doing is to engage the services of an attorney. Have that individual assess whether or not external laws will be applicable to the jurisdiction that you are holding those properties in. For example, we know that if persons own property, real estate in the Caribbean, and if that country is a member of the Commonwealth jurisdiction, then if properties, bits of the estate are mentioned in the will that is drafted in one, then a resealing can be done. Resealing means, at the point of estate administration, the judge is going to affix a seal to the certificate that essentially grants authorization to the executor to act, right, on behalf of the testator. If both jurisdictions are Commonwealth, then a resealing can be done. But let's say the properties are held in a civil jurisdiction. It's not a member of the Commonwealth. Then you have a lot of things to be contemplating. One, is there a will? Two, let's say there is an intestacy or even a partial intestacy, which is dangerous, right?
Sorry, what's that?
So thank you for asking. So a partial intestacy is a situation that is created where you've drafted a will, you have a will in place, but it only contemplates and it only considers properties, assets in one jurisdiction, leaving others out in the cold, right? And if that country so happens to be, let's say, Mexico or any other country in Latin America or in Europe, where it's a different type of law that applies, then you have a situation where your executor is really going to be frustrated trying to make use or sense of the testator's wishes under the will and trying to have those applied in those external jurisdictions.
Oh my goodness.
So it creates quite the conundrum for an executor, and I often recommend professional executors.
Yes.
I believe their experience and their interaction with not just estate laws but also tax laws make them quite the expert in that field. Absolutely, we know that we're going to use family members and friends. That's the culture, but it really spells sense in the long run to hire a professional who can not only go through the testator's wishes as documented by the will, but also preempt what laws will apply, how they're going to be applicable in the particular situation, and pretty much know how to move forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
my mind is running right now because my first question is my country in a commonwealth? I don't even know that. And then you touched on professional executors, and let's talk about that for a second.
Right.
Because a lot of times when we're choosing executors, you're just, who do I know? Who's in my family? Who do I trust in order to execute my will for me? But there are lawyers, and the thing is, not many lawyers are doing this anymore, but there are lawyers or services where people, executive assistants, can help you in closing an estate. So can you speak to what that is, how that helps?
Absolutely. So I'll backtrack a bit to define estate administration. Your estate is essentially what you own, it's your assets. Estate administration is the process by which a testator's will, if there is one, right? Or if there is an intestacy, which is a case that is created where there aren't any last wishes documented in a will. The court will peruse an application, and that application is really being submitted by an individual that comes forward to say, listen, I intend on splitting, sharing the testators or the deceased, if there's an intestacy situation, assets to their beneficiaries, to their heirs, to who I believe they would have wanted to share it to. In the event there is no will, if there is a will, then you definitely have to honor the testator's wishes, right? So that's estate administration. So going forward now to hone in on executor and what their functions are. In drafting a will, it is critical that the testator, the owner of the will, names who they want to carry out their last wishes, who will approach the court, prepare, submit that application to be appointed, to be issued that certificate of appointment. And after being appointed, the estate trustee, who has the requisite knowledge of not just doing a straight share, because not all wills will require a straight share of assets. There are situations where there's a property involved, or many investment properties, right? Where it wasn't a jointly held property, and at this point you have to liquidate, right? So it has to be someone with some level of expertise, someone who is a professional, who will honor the wishes that are documented, someone who is loyal, someone who can be trusted, because that individual is acting as a fiduciary, right? The property is not theirs, but they now have the authorization to handle, to treat the property as if it were theirs. They can liquidate real property. They can make investments, choose to pay maybe the interest to the beneficiaries, keeping, some amount fixed, whatever, as they deem fit and suitable. So in selecting someone who is going to act in that capacity, I always tell my clients, ensure that you go through your mind. It's not an impulsive decision. It's not thinking, oh, I'm happy with so-and-so now, so I'm going to name them, because I'm actually acting on behalf of someone now. Very sad litigation where her mother named her best friend as the executor in the will. And the best friend had no intention of carrying out the deceased mom's wishes. As a matter of fact, she did everything in her power to ensure that, my client, who is the beneficiary, would essentially lose. So she, misappropriated the funds of the estate, for example. And, my client grew quite frustrated. As you can imagine, she's already dealing with the passing of not just any loved one, her mother, right? So for beneficiaries, having to face that level of hurt and pain after mourning a loss, that's a lot.
Yes.
So, as a parent, as someone who is going to create a will, in leaving, assigning, appointing an executor, you really have to ensure that this individual has to be one that can be trusted. Right.
That's painful. I hate hearing those stories.
I know.
And the same thing with beneficiaries. We're going to talk about that in a second. But beneficiaries, you leave them money with the intention that they will, whatever it might be. But that does not mean that that's what will happen. You know,
Absolutely not.
You don't know what life situations are. People can be malicious, but it can also be that life situations are such that they need the money for their care, their health, or whatever it might be. So it's interesting what happens when you have wishes, but when you're no longer here to execute them,
Right.
you have to trust others. So beneficiaries, we talked about that. Let's talk about beneficiaries. As in this case, the beneficiary wants to know what is happening with the estate. When am I going to be receiving any funds? How are you, as the executor, protecting the estate that you're now responsible for? How do we mitigate or how do we manage beneficiaries that are overseas as well? Because they also need information.
Absolutely. So that it's critical, and I'll just put this caveat out there. I'm not a tax lawyer. However, as an estate attorney, I do have to interact with the ITA, the Income Tax Act, and in processing estate admin applications, you do have to interact with these rules, policies, regulations. So let's backtrack a bit. The executor, as a fiduciary of the estate, has that critical duty role to ensure that they are administering the estate fully in a timely fashion and also according to the wishes of the testator. Now, what happens with beneficiaries, right? There is going to be a tax that is triggered because that money, let's say, there's real property being liquidated. You know, you got to pay capital gains tax on 50%. Exactly, right? So the executor will do what is known as a holdback, right? Of some of the assets of the estate, some of the money, to pay over those terminal taxes. And I've seen where beneficiaries find it very hard to accept that, and there becomes a situation where there can be friction. They refuse to sign the release forms, for example, indemnifying the executor. But these tax policies, regulations will not be applicable to beneficiaries who are external, outside of the jurisdiction. Right.
Okay.
It's not going to be, they're not residents of Canada, right? So those are facts, situations that the executor has to contemplate. And in doing the sharing, they also need to figure out, okay, is this going to be deemed as income in the jurisdiction that the beneficiaries are living in? And if it is deemed as income, is there then a tax that they will have to pay, right? I think in the US it is 30% that they have to pay. So again, it's going to be different depending on where these beneficiaries are. But the point here is the executors have a duty to do the necessary research to understand where the beneficiaries are located, where in the world is Carmen San Diego, and, apprise themselves of the necessary rules, policies surrounding the dissemination of the estate.
Oh my goodness. When you hear these stories and you hear about what's actually involved in being an executor, the question really quickly becomes, is this something I actually want to do?
Right.
And then I know that there is, we'll talk about this, I've talked about this before, but there's insurance to cover executors for that exact reason. A lot of people, if you don't know what you're doing and you're trying to do these things, but I don't realize that if you're overseas, I have to account for the additional tax you'll have to pay, or if I forbid you miss a beneficiary, in the paying out of the estate, the family's coming for you.
Exactly.
So you have to make sure that if you choose to be an executor, that you're ready to accept this role and the time that it takes, and that you're willing to put in the work. Or maybe you need to hire someone to assist you in the job.
Exactly,
Right?
exactly. And oftentimes there is a clause, there is a provision in the will that it somewhat indemnifies the executor. It affords for any litigation on behalf of the estate to be paid by funds from the estate. So in that regard, the executor does have somewhat of a cushion. But you are right. We have seen it time and time again where beneficiaries do go after the executor, Oh, that is not what mom said. I'm currently administering an estate where these are adult children, and mom was 98. She redid her will. Sibling thought, oh, she did not have the mental capacity to redo a will at 96 or whenever she did. And as such, that amount under the new will is not what I should be getting. And of course, an application for passing of accounts was submitted to the court, and that's where you have all the friction. But, it's critical again to ensure that you are not just assessing what your assets are, but also who you want to be at the helm of making all those distributions.
Absolutely. It's so funny. I think of all of the people, what you started off saying, assuming that you don't have very much. And then we're going back home. Back home, we're here, and grandma says, oh, you've been taking such good care of me. I'm going to make sure that I take care of you. And someone will take that phrase and they'll claim it as truth. This was a promise.
Yes.
She said she was going to take care of me. And I mean, in my family, like, we had a situation when a loved one passed. Here arose someone who did that exact thing and said, I was told that I'd be taken care of. They ran quickly to wherever and took a property. Wow. And you're thinking, how can this possibly happen? But this is what happens when there's no will, when there's not a family discussion about who you said these things to, so that we're prepared for what might happen. And this is why we have these talks, to normalize these conversations so that we can get started in moving forward.
Absolutely. So with globalization and the, erasing of borders as we knew them.
Yes.
And with digital nomads, people moving all across the world to work, being a resident of one country, one jurisdiction, now being domiciled in another. And, there are so many things that have to be contemplated. Okay, yes, there is immovable property. There's real estate. It's a fixed. But what about the personal property, that's moving around with people? Are they going to be contemplated under the jurisdiction that the worker is now domiciled? Or are we going back to where they are originally a resident? All of these things have to be contemplated. Now, if you go online and you are engaging some website platform to do your basic will kit, none of that gets contemplated, right? So I do want to urge individuals who may be practicing, moving, working in one jurisdiction, living in another, maintaining residence in maybe 2 or more countries. These are things you've surely got to think about, right? And assess, do I need to be speaking with an attorney? Do I need to be speaking with 2 attorneys or 3? Because the attorney in one jurisdiction may not be privy to the laws of another, right? So I touched earlier on the fact that as it relates to the Commonwealth jurisdiction, that means any other province in Canada and any other member of the Commonwealth. Yes, Ontario will reseal that will.
Yes.
But resealing a will that does not mention the estates back home makes no sense. Exactly. Exactly. So one has to do a full assessment of everything that they own, right? And in doing so, they have to then come to terms with the fact that they may need to be speaking with not just one estate attorney, they may need to be engaging the services of more than one, right?
You have me thinking, in this new age, post-pandemic, everybody's living remote, saying, come to Bali, go to Costa Rica, live wherever in all these different jurisdictions now. Where do we fall?
Exactly.
What happens in this case? Let's say somebody is in transition. They're in the process of leaving from Canada to go overseas, or if they're overseas and they want to come to Canada. And if they pass in transition, what are some things, well, not what can they look for, but what are some things that the family or that we can do preemptively to make sure we're covered in both?
The first thing you can do is to have a will and
Yes.
have that will name all your assets.
Okay.
But I did have a situation where my client, who was, it was an intestacy. So her dad passed in
There's no way.
Wyoming, USA. And of course, there are different laws that will apply as it relates to estate administration. So they required, and he had personal property there. He was working there. All his salary was being deposited in a local bank in Wyoming. He also had property here in Ontario. He is ordinarily a Canadian resident living in Ontario. What we had to do was to first apply for probate in Wyoming, get that certificate, get the probate grant, and then have it sent across to me here in Ontario and have that affixed to the application that we were submitting for appointment for certificate of the estate trustee, right? So what we need to do is to first think about, okay, how similar or how tangible are these policies and laws that surround my estate? For example, in Ontario, there is no estate administration tax owing on estates that's below 50,000. He had hundreds of thousands back in Wyoming, right? So that meant his daughter had to first pay those estate administration taxes to have the probate grant issued to her before we could proceed with the small estate application here in Ontario. So yes, it's not just fun and games. We're taking photos in Bali. I'm working here. There's a lot to consider.
Okay, but tell me how long that took.
It took us 6 months.
Yeah.
It took us 6 months. And that's because I was very proactive, pressing the courts. I kept calling, because, of course, I'm not licensed to practice in Wyoming. But as an attorney, it's very easy for me to grapple with the law, see what the requirements were, fulfill those, submit the application, and then come over to my jurisdiction.
Okay.
But the good thing is, or was, it was just a small estate in Ontario. There was no real property, just a car, some money in the bank, that sort of thing. But it would have gotten very, very complex had there been any investment, any property at all.
Yes.
Real property here.
Businesses. Everybody has a business now.
Exactly.
So all of that.
Right?
Yes.
Corporation.
Yes.
Exactly. Right.
How are we feeling? Are we all feeling like, okay, a little overwhelmed and a little happy that we had this conversation and we learned a lot about what's involved in closing an estate, in choosing an executor, and whether we're here or overseas. Either way, the key point is talk to a professional. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your information.
Pleasure.
Please let everyone know where they can find you.
Absolutely. So you can visit my website. It's www.yrussell, that's RUSSELL, and then there's a third L for Legal Professional Corporation, LPC.com. You can also call me 416-800-9891 or 416-499-7077. And there's a free consultation as long as you're an estate client.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you so much for offering even that free consultation.
Absolutely.
Please take advantage of that. I don't know if you want to put a limit on how many people can get that, but we'll let that go for now.
It's a free 15-minute consultation for estate clients. Absolutely.
Perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us. I hope you found this helpful. There'll be more information in the comments where you can get the links to Yanique's website as well, and any other information that I can provide. My website is there and all the information is there. So I will see you again for another episode of Ending Well with Minnelle. Take care and have a great day.